Hello and welcome to this video, this online lecture, Human Dimensions of Wildlife. So as you know, we have actually the problems of present lectures, and so we decided to make our two lectures, the Human Dimensions of Wildlife and also the moderation part, as a video, and we will load it up to the YouTube channel. So you find it here, this video, and the next video is also in this module FOMT 2.3b. My name is Sven Herzog. I'm chair of Wildlife Ecology and Management here in Tarant, and we are working with wild animals and man. So especially this topic, human dimension of wildlife, is in the center of our research activities. We are not looking alone after the zoological and biological and ecological things of wild animals, but also we look also after the interaction with man. Before we are discussing about the human dimensions of wildlife, we have to discuss about what is wildlife. So what does this term mean? So sometimes wildlife is defined to be every free living animal or every free living plant in their ecosystems. This is a quite wide definition. So normally and in practice we have a quite more narrow definition. What means wildlife are free living vertebrates specifically interacting with man. And this specific interaction with man may be very simple. So maybe the wild animals are used as food. They are hunted and cooked or boiled or prepared in another way and eaten. Another possibility of interacting with wildlife is to use wild animals for medical purposes. Another kind of utilization of wild animals is the use for, say, ritual purposes. And also skins and feathers and other products of wildlife can be used for the livelihoods. So this is also a specific interaction between man and wildlife. These are so-called consumptive purposes, and wildlife can also be used for so-called non-consumptive purposes. This differentiation between consumptive and non-consumptive is not so helpful, I think, because, for example, observation of wild animals mostly is declared to be non-consumptive. But if tourists are going to observe wild animals, they also bring disturbances in their ecosystems, and these disturbances change the ecosystem, change the behavior of the animals. So this makes this term non-consumptive also more relative. Also, animal protection, animal conservation is a kind of utilization. Yes, another very interesting interaction is the damage of human property. If animals are damaging human property, they are to be killed, they are to be eliminated, they are captured and brought somewhere else. And last but not least, as I just mentioned, also if an animal is endangered by either direct or indirect human impact, it's also a very important interaction between man and wildlife. If you have a look back over the last millions of years, we can say that round about 4 million of years the evolution of mankind did last. So the first human beings have been detected to be about 4 million years old. And since 2 million years, man is actively hunting other creatures, also wild animals, bigger than man itself. So they are hunting for, say, elephants or for, say, antelopes or something like that. So these specific cultures of hunters we find since about 2 million years. So the half of the development of mankind, they are hunters or hunting cultures. Precondition for this active influencing animals, wild animals, is, I think, the control of fire, for example, and the consequences from becoming hunting cultures are, for example, communication developed quickly, because if you are hunting for a big animal, bigger than yourself, you cannot do it alone. You need a group, and the group needs communication. The group needs also hierarchies. And when people have killed an animal, and there had hundreds of thousands of years ago, not our today's religions, they had imaginations much more close to nature, so there did not make this clear difference between human being here and animal there. And so when they kill an animal, they have to apologize, and they have to be aware that they will meet in another world this animal again. And so we need some rituals of apologization, and these apologizing rituals are, I think, very early manifestations of religion. And even technology develops much more quickly because of man developed mental skills by. So what is the role of wild animals for man during the evolution, during the different phases of evolution of mankind? So on the first stages, so 4 million years ago, human beings are very often prey to large predators, such as lions, such as leopards, such as wolf, such as bear, and so on. Classical predators, they became since 2 million years with the development of these hunters' cultures. And from this time, the animals are predated more and more by man, and not so much vice versa. They are still also prey, but there are more predators than prey at this time. And the animals are also thought to have a kind of function of ancestors. Nearly every culture has myths. These myths are telling stories about original predecessors, people from the Great Lakes in North America. For example, they developed that what we call totemism. So there are a lot of totem animals, like also wolf or beaver or thunderbird, a kind of eagle, and they play an important role in the history, in the ancient history of these people. Later on, say, since 100,000 years up to 10,000 years, wild animals are the basis of domestication. So a lot of animals are domesticated. So our dogs, our domesticated wolves, our cattle is the domesticated, our ox, and something like that. And since, say, 100, 150 years, we have another view on nature and on ecosystems, and since that time, animals are also targets of protection measures, so nature protection and species protection play a more and more important role until today for human beings. And additionally, in the last century, the last decades, animals also serve as a kind of projection screen for what we call Naturromantik. It's not an English word for that, imagination. And this is the way the role of wild animals changed during the evolution of mankind from 4 million years ago until today, in short. And when we think about human dimensions, so the question, how do humans interact with wild animals? They are dependent, for example, on the society. So it's easy to see that a rural society has another view on wildlife, for example, than an industrial society. And they're also dependent on the social group and even on the social status within a social group. But they're also dependent on the generation. So people, say, 30 years ago are thinking in another way about human-wildlife interactions than we do it today, for example. They are dependent more or less on the age. So to see if a child of 3 or 4 or 5 years old has another approach to wild animals than we as a grown-up will do it. And it's also a little bit dependent on gender. So we know that females have another side on wild animals than males, for example. We know it from a lot of studies, especially on the recolonization of large predators. We will hear a little bit more about this example later on. And so we have to ask, what is wildlife management? Wildlife management is maybe not defined, but there are some hints given by Cawthey and Sinclair in the 1990s what wildlife management does mean. So they write, wildlife management either means to make it increase, to make it decrease, to harvest for continuing yield, and to leave it alone and have an eye on it. So what does it mean? Make it increase is clear. So if we have a species that is rare, that is endangered, so we have to try to raise it up, try to increase the population size, for example. Make it decrease is the other example. We have an animal species that is frequent and it's leading to damages of human property, and then people are thinking how we can make it decrease. Sometimes one and the same species in one and the same situation are both So, for example, here in Europe, we have, I mentioned it, the gray wolf. It's a species that's just recolonization in Europe, and there are some places where the species is very frequent, some say too frequent, and in other places it is not yet arrived. So we have both situations in one and the same species in one and the same country. The other example is the red deer in Germany. Red deer is a big deer species, and it is blamed by foresters for damaging trees on the one hand. On the other hand, and it is hunted and it is shot and it has to be reduced, as some landowners say. And on the other hand, there's a lot of areas in Germany where this species is still extinct since the middle of the 19th century. So it's not so clear in some situations if you have to make a species increase or decrease or both. The third point is clear. It's a classical utilization approach. It's a sustainable utilization approach when you say, okay, you harvested for yield, and if you say for a continuing yield, this includes the sustainability aspect. And this is what we are doing with a lot of animal species, wild animal species. For example, roe deer in Germany. For example, elephants in Africa. But elephants may have some problems, as we will see later on, especially the way we look at elephants and the different angles we look at elephants may make this situation a little bit more complicated. Or a fourth point, leave it alone and have an eye on it. This is what we are doing in these large protected areas, for example in national parks, where hunting is not possible. In some national parks, in some countries, hunting is possible, sustainable hunting. In some national parks, we have to keep hands off everything, and this approach means that we do not influence wild animals, we leave it alone, but we have an eye on it, so we have monitoring, for example, and look what happens without any human interaction, and any human direct interaction, we have to say, because there's a lot of indirect interactions, even in the large protected areas we cannot control. Okay, is this everything that makes wildlife management? Is wildlife management only these 4 points? No, it's not. These 4 points are focusing mainly on the abundance, on the density, on the number of individuals of a species. And wildlife management is much more than only influencing the density. And so we made another definition, or we adapted another definition. So we say wildlife management means the coordination and administration of tasks to achieve a goal concerning wildlife population, including interaction of wildlife and man. And so wildlife management includes more than only reducing or keeping hands off. It means, for example, education is very important, to bring the information to the people about wildlife, the information about what endangers a population, but also the information why is the population no longer endangered. Wildlife management also means law enforcement. It means influence on land use and a lot of other things more. In some situations, I mentioned sustainability. And sustainability is very important in wildlife management, and it's also very important in the human-wildlife interactions. So what does sustainability mean? We know, or you know, that sustainability has 3 dimensions, and this means the economic, the ecological, and the socio-cultural dimension. And sustainability means, simply spoken, that our generation is obliged to keep all these benefits and all these values we have. We have, for example, in wildlife, and we have in ecosystems. We are obliged to guarantee also for the next generations that they can utilize the benefits of wildlife. Costs of wildlife management should be covered by the management benefits that makes wildlife management from an economic viewpoint sustainable. And also the minimization of transfer payments is very important in this context. The ecological sustainability means especially the long-term preservation and also the development, the improvement of habitats, of ecosystems. It means the maintenance of healthy and adaptable populations. And we know that one of the 2 pillars of species preservation is sustainable utilization. So the other pillar is a total protection. Total protection, as we have in many protected areas, is one pillar, and the other more important pillar in most parts of the world is sustainable utilization. Because protection without utilization is a topic of industrial countries, and a lot of regions in the world are not able to pay for total protection with all the consequences, as we will see later on. So utilization is also a way of a sustainable financing the ecological goals. So we have a link between ecological and economical sustainability. And the last but not least point is the social-cultural sustainability. We all know that we have a lot of cultural connections to wild animals. I mentioned some of them. Today, for example, also animal welfare is a very important point of social-cultural sustainability. Every management of wild animals has to be asked in how far it meets the animal welfare question. So is there, if you are hunting an animal, we have to avoid pain, or we have to avoid fear and all these things before we kill this animal. And it is not the question, are we allowed to kill an animal or not? It is the question, how do we do this? How is our cultural background in the context of animal hunting, for example? Another very interesting topic is a question of rituals having to do with the animals. For example, we know that the Maasai warriors have an initiation ritual, meaning killing a lion with a spear, very traditional. And this is also part of socio-cultural sustainability. Some people are gathering feathers from a certain bird species out in the forest and bring them back, and doing this for an initiation procedure. A third example is traditional medicine, and it's a very interesting example because especially traditional medicine is often blamed to be not sustainable. because it is connected directly with the questions of rhino horn, with the questions of pangolin, and so on. And yes, this is a problem, and this is a problem also of, say, what do we call, for example, traditional Chinese medicine? And here, maybe not the traditional medicine per se is a problem in sustainability, but the way how do we perform this traditional medicine. What are our recent problems? There's a lot of problems, huge problems in the wildlife-man interaction. I give you some examples. So now we have a growing human population. Everybody knows that. And this human population growth is the reason for so many problems we have today. So the first and the maybe most important is climate change. It's connected with human population growth. It's not so much connected if we are driving by electric cars or not. It is a problem of human population growth. And human population growth leads to significant habitat losses for wildlife. Another maybe connected with that problem is the urbanization. So the growing human population is more and more allocated in big urban regions. And the impact of these big urban regions of their surrounding natural or semi-natural landscapes, ecosystem is huge. Another very important problem in some regions is crop raiding. Crop raiding maybe by elephants. And here we have this classical problem of elephants. On the one hand, elephant is maybe locally endangered, but not in total endangered. In Africa, we have more than enough elephants, but their distribution is maybe inadequate. And the other point is that elephants are doing a lot of damages, and these damages are much more a problem, for example, than when a red deer or a roe deer eats a forestry here in Germany. But these crop raiding problems are not so well known in the nature conservation groups, or they are denied maybe also from these groups. So here we have to find a way to solve the problem on the one hand, or to reduce the problem, and doing this without endangering a species like elephant. And there are very good examples that it works if we like to do it sufficiently. Nature conservation, for example, the bushmeat question is also very interesting today. You know that especially in the tropical regions, for example, logging or prospecting for natural resources leads to more and more ways, roads, paths, and so on into the forest, into the more or less untouched regions. And as a consequence, people come in more easily in these regions, and they hunt for a lot of species, local species. They sell them on the markets, and this bushmeat also is exported between different states and something like that. And so bushmeat maybe is not a problem of utilization, it is a problem of uncontrolled utilization. So I don't think bushmeat is per se a problem. It is a problem because we have no control of sustainability of this utilization. And how we can do that in the future, that is a big open question today. Another question of nature conservation is one after what are, for example, the northern countries, Europe, USA, allowed to do to influence the situation in the southern countries? What about neocolonialism and nature conservation? So if we in Europe do say, yes, we do no longer allow import of different products, independent of the question if the local government in the local country says, okay, we have a good situation of the population, we can allow to export, we can allow to hunt for this species. This is what some people call neocolonialism, because it is an influence of our European point of view to countries. They are of their own responsibility for the natural resources, in my opinion. The animal welfare question is also very interesting because it's also connected with special cultural preconditions, and different cultures, different ethnic groups have different ideas about animal welfare. And it's also very interesting if we find a common level. What is the minimum standard of animal welfare, for example? The question of zoonotic diseases. Actually, now we are discussing about African swine fever. It's not a zoonotic disease, but it's a disease that influences agriculture. Or if we are discussing about the COVID-19 pandemia, it's a zoonotic disease, and we discussed how did this virus slip from a wild animal into the human population. And this is often a problem of the wet markets, of this uncontrolled utilization of wild animals. We don't find a direct connection and say, okay, this or that animal brought this virus into the human population. But we know that non-sustainable utilization of animals and an uncontrolled utilization of animals is a risk of bringing different diseases. So actually COVID is maybe not Ebola, but we all know that there are much more serious diseases that can slip from wild animals to human beings. Corruption is always and everywhere a problem, not only in special countries. Everywhere we have this corruption problem. Some countries have more problems with it, some countries have less, but even here in Germany we have corruption problems. And it is not so easy to solve these problems because it's connected with, for example, poetry. It's connected with special social structures and so on. And so we have, as Europeans, for example, or as North Americans, we have to be very careful to blame some countries of the South to be more corrupt than others. So it's a very difficult and a very specific problem that we have to solve for the future. And it's not easy and will not be easy to solve it. So one question in the context of human-wildlife interaction is the question of human-wildlife conflicts. What are human-wildlife conflicts? Are these conflicts really conflicts between man and wildlife? Or are human-wildlife conflicts more conflicts between different human groups? I think both could be the case, but the latter one, the conflict between different human groups, is much more frequent. And what we call human-wildlife conflict very often is a conflict not between humans and wildlife, but between human groups. For example, we have different groups, conservationists. We have national park administrations. We have farmers. They are also resident. We have pastoralists. They are moving. We have local communities. We have local ethnic groups. We have a central government. We have tourism, and tourism is not uniform. Tourism has also a lot of aspects. For example, hunting tourism against photo tourism. This discussion is very old, and there are local hunters, there are tourist hunters then, for example, and there are even poachers, and all these groups have to interact and are interacting, and from this interaction the conflicts are arising. And in very many cases, animals are only a projection screen for these conflicts between humans. Nevertheless, we have to solve the conflicts and we have to solve the problem. And so we need this conflict management, and wildlife management is classically a conflict management. It is not making increase or decrease. It's also making increase and decrease, but it's not primarily making this. Primarily, wildlife management is a conflict management between humans. And therefore, we have to build an algorithm. How do we manage these conflicts? And for managing these conflicts, first we have to identify. We have to identify the group who has different interests, and how do these different interests of different groups come into a conflict. Then we have to describe the conflicts. We have to define the goals of the different stakeholders, and we have to do it honestly. So in discussions, in moderations, we often have to find out what is the real goal of a different group of stakeholders. And the next and the, I think, most difficult step should be to bring these goals into an order. And this means also to set either spatial and or temporal priorities to solve or to achieve the goals. And as tools, as very good and very helpful tools, we know that participation is a very important tool in the conflict management, what means a bottom-up approach, not a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach, including all people having a problem in a certain situation. And sometimes it's better to work with the local people directly, not with some NGOs, not with some representatives, not with some chiefs. Maybe, okay, we have to include the chiefs in most cases, but not with some governments, and do it from bottom up in moderated sessions. And so moderation is a second tool. It's very helpful, and you will learn in this module certainly a lot of these things, and we will have a look especially to moderation in another video. Let's come to an example. The example is hunting, and how can we integrate hunting in a sustainable wildlife management concept. So we have to differentiate between three forms of hunting. Hunting for subsistence, what means people are utilizing their prey by themselves. Then hunting for markets, it means people are selling at least a part of their prey. And the third point is the leisure hunting. This is an example what we have, for example, it is what we call trophy hunting, hunting tourism, and so on. And we know that especially hunting is a very important tool in wildlife management, because hunting can solve several problems. It can solve the problem of getting food, getting meat, for example, and it can also simultaneously solve the problem of crop raiding, for example. So hunting can, hunting in a sustainable way is able to be a very integrative tool in wildlife management and can solve several problems. So I gave you here some very actual examples from literature, from scientific literature. So one paper deals with the question of how can local communities benefit from elephants. So how can we help the local communities no longer to support, for example, the poachers, but support more and more the anti-poaching activities? What should their benefits be? What can we give to the local communities from elephant hunting? And how can this help to solve the actual problems? What means trophy hunting is a very important conservation tool. We know that from the situation of hunting bans in the past. You all know that, for example, Kenya has a hunting ban in the 1970s. And since this declaration of the hunting ban, for example, Reno decreased very quickly. So not hunting does not mean an increase, but it does mean a decrease. Why? Due to poaching, due to uncontrolled hunting. As long as we have a controlled form of hunting, hunters themselves are prohibiting poaching. But if you ban hunting, if you bring the legal hunters out of the area, then the poachers will take the system over. And this is a very impressive example of Kenya with this decrease of wildlife after the hunting ban. But it's not only a hunting ban, the problem also the wildlife trade bans have to be discussed. We all know this CITES contracts, and we know that a lot of products that are very expensive in a market or in a black market, wherever, are banned to trade. So is it helpful or not? So in the 1970s, 1980s, we thought it to prohibit the trade would help to protect nature. Until today, we have more experience and we know it's not the case in every situation. So one example are these ivory burning activities. They are burning a lot of ivory confiscated from the poachers, but does it help to protect elephants or not? Ivory burning at the first sight leads to a shortage of the product. So a rare product becomes a little bit more rare after these ivory burning actions. And in an illegal market, a shortage means only an increase of the prices. And the other problem is that these ivory burning actions, they bring a gloss over corruption, so nobody knows how many tons really are burning there and how many tons are noted in the books. A very interesting example also was the decision of President Trump no longer ban the import of hunting trophies from Zimbabwe or from Zambia to the US. And some hours after this act was declared, there was a shitstorm from nature conservation organizations. So how can Trump do this? And this is for me a very interesting example for that what we call neocolonialism. So we are not in a situation to tell African governments, African countries, how they have to manage their own efforts. So I think they are able to do that very well by themselves. And if Zimbabwe and if Zambia are thinking that they are managing their hunting in a sustainable way, we have to accept that from them, and we have not to blame them for being not sustainable. Another question is that of community-based approaches. It's a very interesting aspect and an interesting way of becoming more and more sustainable in wildlife utilization. If you give the benefits or a huge part of the benefits from nature utilization, for example, from hunting, from the money paid for trophy hunting, for example, to the local communities and make them financially bring them in a good situation, so they are no longer in a situation they have to support poaching. They are no longer in the situation to kill any animal that damages the crop, because the animal itself is maybe more of a higher value than the crop, and so we can come to a solution, a long-term solution that helps us to bring species conservation, nature conservation, and economic surviving in even poorer regions together. And there are very good examples, beginning with the old campfire project in Zimbabwe, for example. Actually, we have in Africa also a lot of similar approaches. Actually, we have also similar approaches in Central Asia and in other places. Now, very quickly, example from Germany. So I give you an example from Germany because we also have a lot of problem of human-animal interaction, and we have a lot of conflict. We have also the conflict not between humans and the animals. We have the conflict between different stakeholders, and our human dimension of wildlife are not so much easier to manage than those of other countries and other regions of the world. So we have the example of the return of the recolonization of gray wolf here in Germany. We had in the 19th century, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, gray wolf was extinct here in Germany. It has to do a lot with the livelihoods of a rural population with a very small-scaled agroeconomy, and the small domestic ruminants have been the basis of a subsistence economy. And so there was no regular hunting for wolves, but it was a kind of pest control. So every wolf was killed that has been seen. And so wolf was extinct not due to habitat losses, as it is the case in the most situations, but it was extinct by direct human activities against the wolf. And actually, wolf is returning, and we have some clear goals we have to fulfill. We have to establish an adaptable population capable for a long-term survival. We have to guarantee no unacceptable risks for man. We have no unacceptable economic damages. This is actually the biggest problem, and we should have no unacceptable conservation problems of other species. And you see here the term unacceptable means a very relative term, so nobody can clearly explain and clearly define what means unacceptable in a certain situation. So it's to be made clear in any individual situation. And if you have a look on the distribution of gray wolf, we see a huge population in Eastern Europe and in Asia. And what we find in Germany, we are here, is the westernmost part, say the westernmost outpost of this big population. So the first we see, gray wolf is not endangered as a species. It is maybe endangered in some parts of Europe. And now these parts are recolonized. We have an exponential population growth, for example, in Germany or in Poland. And simultaneously, we have increasing conflict. So we have a conflict with the livestock breeders. We have a conflict with pastoralists. We have also some conflicts with hunters, some conflicts with local communities, and more increasing conflicts with transport and traffic due to car accidents, with cattle that has been panicked after wolf attacks. Wolf is strictly protected according an EU directive, and in the majority of the EU countries, utilization of gray wolf is strictly prohibited. So the ban of hunting, the ban of any legal utilization, and German people are following the law quite well. As you see, the wolf population is dramatically increasing. Here we have the beginning of the 2000s. There's the first pair and the first pack established in Germany, and now 20 years later we have actually much more than 100 packs. A pack is about, say, 8 individuals, and we have a lot of sessile pairs and so on. So the wolf number in Germany is, yes, estimated somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000, say. So it's a rough estimation. And simultaneously, here I show you now the data from France, because in Germany we don't have the data so well prepared. The number of wolf attacks on domestic animals increased in a similar way. The number of victims of domestic animal, of sheep, goat, and even cow, cattle and horses increased. And this is very interesting. The compensation payments in 2004, they have been in France, only in France, 500,000 euros, and in 2016 they are 3.5 million euros roundabout, and still increasing. So these are our problems with wolf. Maybe not the only problems, but the most important problems. And these problems are due to successful development of the wolf population. Yes, we can say that. But wildlife management is not only measured in the increase of the wolf population. Wildlife management is also, in its success, evaluated what happens with the conflicts between people. And the conflicts, as you have seen, are still increasing. And this is due to some problems we have in our management. So we are very much unstructured processes dominated by nature conservation NGOs. We have say, questionable information policy, but means that the numbers of individuals have a time lag of, in the past, more than a year, actually nearly a year until we get the actual numbers. There's a high amount of frustration among the farmers or the pastoralists, because they have a lot of bureaucracy obstacles to get a compensation. And we have very few involvement of scientific expertise, especially expertise from the Eastern Europe, where they are much more familiar with the wolf than we are here. And so if you have a look at our tools, what management tools do we use and what management tools we don't use, it's a very interesting picture. So we nearly don't use participatory processes in decision making. Also, decision making should involve the local people and the directly influenced people. But our German way is more a top-down way. We have management plans for wolf, yes, but they are not very helpful, because they don't tell us what to do in a situation. They tell us whom have I to ask to get a permit to do something or not. So it's also a big obstacle by bureaucracy in these management plans. We have a very well established abundance. Monitoring, yes, we know quite well how many wolves. but we have no prophylaxis against epidemic diseases. We have no emergency plans. What happens if an animal maybe with rabies is occurring inside a city? We have no clear definition of targets, say how many wolves I would like to have in the next 5 or 10 years. And we have only few methods of repellent or of deterring activities. So deterrent agents are mostly lacking. Deterrent agents like electric fence or something like that, they work quite well for a while, and sometimes the wolf learns how to get over this obstacle or dig under this obstacle, and then we have the next step of trying to keep the wolf out. And this next steps maybe a higher fence or a second fence or something like that. Works for a while and so on. The question of compensation payments, I just told you, are existing but very bureaucratic and maybe not sufficient. The bureaucracy means that, for example, there have been a DNA test from a sheep that has been attacked by the wolf or by a canid. We don't know if it was a wolf. And there has to be a DNA test if this attacking individual was really a wolf or not. And this test is much more expensive as the sum that has been paid as a compensation for the sheep. And this is not understood by the pastoralists and farmers. Other management tools are not so relevant. Habitat management we don't need because wolves use any habitats here in Central Europe. And public relations, we have more than enough. And nobody, I think, is still believing that the wolf has eaten the little Red Riding Hood and the grandmother. So what to do for the future? We need a more active management, and this active management should be fact-based and should avoid political taboos. So we have a lot of political taboos. Actually, for example, hunting of the wolf is a classical taboo. Nobody is discussing these questions. Or the other side, also reintroduction in certain regions would help maybe also, for example, would help to avoid hybridization with domestic dogs. It's also a classical taboo. So this makes the situation much more complicated. For example, if we would allow to think about a start of a sustainable utilization of wolf, a lot of problems could be solved at a very early stage and should not exacerbate. We should involve more and more expertise from outside Germany. So actually people in France have some experience with management plans. People from Scandinavia have a very interesting approaches. People from the Baltic states have very interesting approaches and so on. We should learn from them. We should learn from independent research, and last but not least, maybe last but most important, we should try participatory processes. We know it from many, many parts of the world that participatory processes are working if we honestly try to implement them. And these bottom-up processes we would need also here in Germany for the wolf. Okay, what is the result of this lesson. We have seen that human dimensions of wildlife are, I think, very interesting. They are involving a lot of parts of our life, some of you and some of us more, some of us less. People from rural regions are more involved in this human-animal interaction than people from the big urban regions and so on. We have seen that conflicts between man and wildlife are quite rare. Much more often we have conflicts not between directly man and wildlife, but between man and other people, especially different stakeholders. Different stakeholders, often represented by different NGOs, and these organizations, especially NGOs, sometimes are also more interested, not every time, but sometimes are more interested in keeping, in conserving a problem than in solving a problem, because a lot of NGOs are paid more by the existence of a problem than if the problems would have been solved. And so what we can recommend is try to solve the problems not on an emotional, not on an ideological basis. Try to solve them on a fact basis and try to solve them in a bottom-up way, in a participatory process and in moderated processes. And so this is also why moderation is a very important part of wildlife management. And this means that in another video, I will give you some hints how to moderate a group of people to reach a goal. Okay, so far for today. Thank you very much and see you in the next video.